Hello, everybody, and welcome to an introduction to epistemology. We're going to be talking about the nature of epistemology in this lesson, explaining what the concept is, and then outlining the scope of this series of lessons. This is a brand new series on the philosophy of epistemology. We're going to be taking this over the next few weeks and months, and ultimately, we can conclude at the very beginning of this series of lessons straight away that epistemology is one of the most important and wide-reaching areas of philosophy. You would argue that epistemology falls into one of the major categories of philosophy, along with metaphysics, aesthetics, and even ethics and political philosophy. And so, as a result of which, it is important and would be a compulsory set of lessons for any student of philosophy who's thinking about going to university to study philosophy more formally. You will have to do at least one compulsory set of lessons on the subject of epistemology. At least I had to when I did my undergraduate degree in philosophy a few years ago. And so as a result of which, we're going to take this subject and explore it in more detail. This lesson is going to be quite simple, though, because what we're going to do is ask the very simple and very basic question of what actually is epistemology? What actually does it mean to study epistemology? What kinds of things does an epistemologist study? And then we will finally look at the scope of this series of lessons, talk about what we're actually going to be covering and exploring. So let's ask and then answer the first of these questions. We're going to ask the question, what is epistemology? And fundamentally, and in a simply put, from a traditional perspective, epistemology is the study of and the philosophy of knowledge. That is what epistemology is. The word itself derives out of the ancient Greek episteme, which comes to roughly be translated to meaning understanding, or even to just roughly translate to knowledge itself. And so the idea of epistemology and to talk about things like epistemic values or epistemic injustice, all of these different things that you may have heard of in other areas of philosophy as well, you are talking about the concept of knowledge when you apply this sort of epistemological element to the start as a prefix to a number of different phrases and concepts. And so epistemology is the study of knowledge, and it is the philosophy of knowledge. Epistemology will study the nature, the scope, and the origin of knowledge. It will discuss and study the justification for belief and acceptance of such knowledge, as well as the rationality of the belief in certain pieces of knowledge. And this particular passage that I've written here really gives us an indication of the kind of things that we're going to be looking at in this series of lessons. I'm not going to spoil it until we get to the end of this lesson and we actually outline the scope in more detail. But fundamentally, epistemology talks about the nature of knowledge and explores and philosophizes about the nature of knowledge. It talks about the ways in which we can justify our belief in a particular piece of knowledge. Why can we argue that we believe or understand this knowledge to be true and maybe understand other pieces of knowledge to be false? Where do we find the foundations of our justification for the belief and acceptance of some pieces of knowledge versus the disbelief and the rejection of other pieces of knowledge? And from this, let's just go in a bit more detail to looking at what epistemology studies. What does epistemology itself actually involve the study of? Again, this is going to be touching on what we looked at in the previous slide. And fundamentally, given that epistemology is the philosophy of knowledge, it gives us the kinds of questions that an epistemologist will study and will attempt to answer. Now, of course, whether or not they're successful in answering it is really dependent on your position relating to a number of these different questions. But fundamentally, epistemologists attempt to answer the following questions. They will ask the question, what actually is knowledge? So when I say I have knowledge of something, I have been given knowledge of something, or I am looking to obtain knowledge of something. What is the thing that I'm trying to do? What is the actual thing that I'm trying to get knowledge to understand? if I want to obtain knowledge of something, what am I actually obtaining? What actually is knowledge itself? What does it mean to say that some knowledge exists? Almost looking at this from an ontological perspective. From there, once we have understood and have an idea of the kinds of knowledge that exist and what knowledge fundamentally is, how can we justify belief in knowledge? So, given that there is quite a vast wealth of knowledge that exists, an almost near exponential amount of knowledge that can exist owing to the invention of the internet, and just the growth of things like social media, for example, which could tie into some of the more contemporary issues here. How can we justify a belief in something? If I say I believe X, the question of justification is essentially a question of why. Why is it the case that you believe X? What is the foundational understanding for how you come to a conclusion about believing in something X versus not believing in it? And you can try to rationalize and come to some kind of coherent system by which you can come to conclusions about which kinds of knowledge will and will not be believed and justified on the basis of belief. And why do I lack belief in other pieces of knowledge versus believing in some other pieces of knowledge? Where do we get knowledge from? How can we formulate a theory of knowledge which examines the kinds of sources of knowledge? This can also tie into the first question, which asks, as a subsidiary issue, what actually is knowledge? What are the different kinds of knowledge that exist? So where does knowledge come from? How do we derive knowledge from various different senses, various different perceptions, and non-perceptual understandings of knowledge as well? We'll get into the distinction, for example, between a priori and a posteriori knowledge, and the distinction that is made there between things like basic rational understandings of knowledge and logical formulations of knowledge versus empiricism and establishing an understanding of knowledge through empirical senses. What does it mean to be rational? How do we conclude whether or not somebody is rational in their beliefs and their belief system? And then finally, how can we talk about skepticism? If you are skeptical of a piece of knowledge, how can we justify skepticism, and why can we justify skepticism as well? All of these questions give us a little bit of an indication as to the scope of this series of lessons, because fundamentally those questions are what we're going to attempt to answer, or at least talk about the philosophers who have attempted to answer in this series of lessons over the next few weeks and months. We're going to explore the fundamental issues relating to the knowledge and the theory of knowledge and epistemology itself. As such, this is going to be divided into 4 main sections, each of which containing a number of different lessons therein. The first section is going to ask the question of what actually is knowledge. This gives us some indication of the kinds of issues that we're going to talk about here, so things like the concept of truth, the types of knowledge, a basic introduction to the justification of knowledge, as well as something known as Gettier epistemology and post-Gettier epistemology, one of the most fundamental and foundational theories relating to the existence of and the classification of knowledge itself. The next section is going to be arguably and probably the largest section, which is the justification for knowledge. Epistemological justification is one of the biggest areas of epistemology itself. The kinds of epistemological or epistemic justification, we can talk about things like doxastic epistemology, internalist theories of epistemology, foundationalism, coherentism, explanationalism, and reliabilism, all of which are theories which attempt to find a coherent understanding relating to how one is able to justify belief in some knowledge versus a lack of belief in other knowledge, in the rejection of other pieces of knowledge. The third section will talk about rationalism and empiricism. We'll talk about the various different sources of knowledge, the distinction between a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge as well. We'll talk about empiricism in a lot of detail. We'll talk about the theory of tabula rasa, which is something that is developed in the sort of Enlightenment period of philosophy, as well as looking at Kantian interpretations of knowledge, the idea of the kind of synthetic a priori understanding of the acquisition of knowledge as well. And then finally, in the final section, we'll talk about epistemological skepticism. So we'll talk about what external world skepticism says, we'll talk about what the philosopher Moore says relating to skepticism, finishing by talking in a little bit of detail about the concept of contextualism.